Thank you, Gerard. Can people hear me okay? I'm completely deaf, so I can't tell whether my voice is projecting or not. I'm also a victim of pretty serious jet lag, having flown overnight from Canada to be here. And sometimes when that happens and I jet lag, my voice tends to peter out and I don't notice. So if at some point you can't hear me, you're either welcome to ask me to raise my voice or you're welcome to use the captioning that I've been using for the first part of the day today. In any case, I want to speak for a few minutes and shift gears a little bit. We had a very interesting presentation this morning about some pretty challenging ideas that are related to the convention and so on. And that's important stuff, but I wanted to talk more about some of the process things around that. But first of all, I'd like to thank Professor Quinn for the invitation to be here. I've heard about the summer school for a number of years from people all around the world, and been envious of their opportunity to come to Ireland and to learn and to talk with colleagues and so on. So I'm delighted to be here, and I'm delighted that it's worked out that I'm able to be here for the full week. So I see this really as more of a learning experience for me than something for me to come and impart a lot of wisdom for you. But I was involved a bit in the negotiations around the convention, and I wanted to talk a bit about that because I think that as we move forward with the treaty, it's useful to have a sense of the role that disabled people and our organizations played in that process. I think that, as Gerard said, I work with an organization called Disabled Peoples International, which probably most of you folks are aware of. Our headquarters office is in Canada, and I work at the Canadian headquarters of DPI, and have done that on and off for many, many years. And I've been involved in disability work at an international level for about 20 years. And the last 10 years of that has really been pretty much wrapped up with the convention. I'm looking at Janet Lord sitting there and thinking that about 10 years ago this month, she invited me to a meeting in Washington. And it was the first time I was at an international meeting to talk about the Convention on the Rights of People with Disabilities. So that's 10 years ago this month, and we've come a long way in that 10 years. And I wanted to talk for a few minutes about the involvement of disabled people's organizations in that. But also, as I said, I want to shift gears a bit and maybe make this a little bit more conversational. I don't see myself as any expert around this stuff. I think probably there are a lot of people in the room who have at least as much, if not more, experience with the process than I do, and I would like to hear from you. Also, as Gerard said, the president is coming at about noontime, and there are some very strict protocols around that. I can't be up here yammering when the president is coming in the room, so they will take a cane and pull me off a minute or two before, and he will be introduced and so on. So we have very strict time frames here, and to try to keep with that. I had thought I was going to have a little bit more time, so I had set up my my remarks in 3 sections. I was going to talk a little bit about how we got to a treaty, why we started that process in 2002. Then I wanted to talk about the role of disabled people and our organizations in the actual negotiations. Then, time permitting, I was going to talk a bit about what's happened since the treaty entered into force in terms of role of people with disabilities and our organizations. Given that time is a little tight, I'm going to make a large assumption that everyone in the room already knows all of the things that led up to 2002 when we got in the room and started to negotiate a convention. You probably have been involved in this long enough to know all of the antecedents in that process, and I won't bother to repeat them. So what I will do instead is talk a little bit about the second and third parts of my presentation, and that really the engagement of people with disabilities once we got to New York in August of 2002. And I remember that time in a very special way. I think probably all of us who were involved in the early days of the convention can remember piling into the hotels in New York City that August and really being kind of astonished, first of all, to be in the UN and be talking about these sorts of things. It's a pretty intimidating kind of process for a guy from a little town in Canada, like I am at least. And I think that a lot of our organizations and a lot of people in those beginning days were just trying to figure figure out what we were doing, why we were there, and how we were going to move the process forward. The first meeting of the ad hoc committee in August of 2002, in my mind at least, boiled down to a very simple proposition. Do we need a convention or don't we need a convention? It was back and forth, people talking about, yes, we do need a convention, no, we don't need a convention. And people with disabilities and our organization played a really pivotal role in that process, in my view at least. Because in those early days of the convention, myself and colleagues from disability organizations around the world were there in the halls of the UN, and we were talking to diplomats and negotiators who in very many cases had never met a person with a disability before in their lives. Most of these folks were people who were working in New York in the UN system and were negotiating on a variety of different things. And they were simply handed a file and said, okay, for some reason, we're going to talk about whether we need to have a convention on the rights of people with disabilities or not. That's what the ad hoc committee was called to discuss in August of 2002. And my observation as somebody who spent the 2 weeks there was that most of the governments, most of the negotiators went into those meetings with a view that they really wanted to stop the process. There wasn't a lot of enthusiasm at the diplomatic or national level or international level for a CRPD, but there had been a process 20, 30 years before that that led us to the point of getting to the UN. So really, the point of, or the work that we did in the first meeting was to get to know the diplomats, to get to know the negotiators and get a sense of, or to move them to a sense of why we need to have a convention or not. That happened in 2002 and it happened again in 2003. At the 2003 meeting, we moved beyond whether we should have a convention or not, and we started to talk about drafting. And the meetings after 2003 were what I think of as the substantive meetings of the ad hoc committee. Those were the times from the time the working group met in January of 2004 through to the end. That's when we talked about the nuts and bolts of the convention. We talked about the articles and how we moved it forward. And people with disabilities took on a somewhat different role in that process. We were engaged in a variety of ways. There were NGOs that were participating. There were people with disabilities that were part of national delegations. We were working together behind the scenes. We were making interventions, trying to move things forward, and so on. But we were really continuing in a lot of ways to be the conscience of the process and to continue to move it forward. At a national level, our organizations were all around the world also working. I want to talk a little bit about the Canadian experience here, because in Canada and in lots of other countries around the world, between the meetings of the ad hoc committee, what was going on was disabled people's organizations were looking at the draft text and commenting on the text and talking about ways to improve it, talking about concerns and so on. So in Canada, between each of the meetings between 2004 and 2006, there was a national consultation that took place of disabled people's organizations to look at the substance of the text and to try to move things forward. And my role in those processes was to facilitate those discussions, but also then, as a member of the Canadian government delegation and an advisor from the disability community, I traveled to New York to participate and took the results of those national consultations that we did in Ottawa and that we did by email intersessionally into the meeting rooms and into the actual planning sessions for the government as we moved through the drafting. And that was happening in a number of national delegations around the world. So there was a real high level of engagement for people with disabilities, continuing to be the conscience, but also, again, because so few of the people who were doing the negotiation, the lawyers and the people from departments of foreign affairs, very few of them had a lot of understanding or experience about disability issues. So we were not just the heart of the process, but in many ways the mind of the process as well, in terms of how does this connect to disability. People knew what human rights were, but they didn't necessarily know how to connect that to the lived experience of persons with disabilities. So that, in my view, is a very quick thumbnail sketch of the engagement or the role of disabled people and our organizations in the process. We could talk for days about the details of this, and I'm happy to speak with you about it at any point over the course of the week, but I just wanted to touch on some of the highlights of that because I think it's very important to keep in mind the role of disabled people and our organizations as we move the convention forward. The treaty has entered into force. Many countries, 180 countries or however many countries, have ratified the convention, and now we're getting to the point where we're saying, okay, we've got this international convention. What does it actually mean? How do you translate this UN Convention on the Rights of People with Disabilities into the reality of the ways that governments govern, that programs are delivered, that people with disabilities actually participate on an equal basis with others, whatever that might mean, in their societies? And I think that the key here is to look in the convention at Article 33 and also at Article 4, Section 3, about the inclusion of people with disabilities. I'd connect this back to the actual drafting process, because as I said, it was very apparent in the drafting process that disabled people and their organizations were essential to this, not just the heart of the process, not just the soul of the process, but also the mind of the process. We're the ones, our organizations are the ones that think through in detail what it is to realize the right to health, the right to education, whatever it is, for people with disabilities. And as we move forward, as the convention takes on a life of its own in countries all around the world, it's absolutely essential, in my view, that disabled people and their organizations continue to be a part of this process. Because I think that, and we're seeing this in Canada now, where I come from, there's a move away from engagement of people with disabilities in the implementation of the CRPD. Governments are taking more control over it, and disabled people's organizations are being left outside. And there's a problem with that. There's an inertia that's creeping in already, I see, in Canada and other countries around the world. And I would argue that the key antidote, if you will, for that inertia is the re-engagement of disabled people at a national level, at a regional level, in the implementation of the convention. So those are a couple of thoughts that I wanted to share with you. As I say, I'm keen to hear what other people have to say. I'm mindful of the fact that we've only got about 5 minutes or so before the president is going to come in. So I would like to open it up to questions, comments on the floor for a few minutes. And Gerard said to me also that if it was necessary, if we wanted to pick it up after lunch, we could do that. But I'd really like to hear from you. So thanks very much, and the floor is open.
Of Ireland, Michael D. Higgins, accompanied by Mrs. Sabina Higgins.